Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of this channel called Patrick the Runner. My name is Patrick Sheridan and as always I'm here to talk about running. I'm excited about the topic of this week's video because I'm going to talk about the concept of threshold training, and it's something that I think can help you all out there to get faster, but also I think it's a timely video because next week I'm going to be doing a video on the lactate testing that I'm getting at the weekend. So the idea is that this video will help you to understand the type of data that I'm going to be receiving when I'm doing the lactate testing. So I think it would be a good idea to explain firstly what I'm referring to when I'm talking about threshold training. And when I'm talking about the term threshold training, what I'm actually referring to is lactate threshold training. And I think it would be a good idea also to give a definition of what I understand lactate to be. So to my mind, lactate is a metabolic byproduct that is produced when your body is using glucose as a source of energy. And what's important to understand here is that the harder you're working and the faster that you're running, the more glucose you're going to be using as a source of energy, and the higher the blood lactate concentration in your body is going to be. So effectively, the more glucose you're using, the harder you're working, and the more lactate that's going to be in your body. So in running, we use lactate as a measure of effort and exertion. So that's imperative to understand at the start of this video. Before going any further, I just wanted to say that the intention in this video is not to become overly obsessed with the detail, and I don't want to get too technical in my delivery because firstly, I'm not qualified to. I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm not a biochemist. I'm not a scientist. So I'm not an expert in this area. But what I am is a fairly decent runner, and I have a general understanding of what has helped me over the last 15 months to make the progress that I have. Secondly, I don't think that people need to necessarily have an in-depth understanding of why something works in terms of understanding all of the science, because a lot of the things in life that we know work and we know help, we don't actually understand everything there is to understand behind it. We just know that something works. And effectively what I'm saying is that a lot of my training is based on what I've read and what I know to have helped me. But my approach to training has been more empirical than science-based. And what I'm saying is that anecdotally, I can tell you that a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about works for me, and I have a general understanding, as I've said, of why it works, but I don't want to delve too much into the detail because I don't think that will interest people, and we all are runners, so we are more interested in getting faster than we are getting overly technical into the detail. And I don't mean that I'm not going to give you information about what I understand. What I just mean is that I don't want to become too bogged down in the science. Saying that, I just wanted to clarify quickly one slightly technical thing. So when I'm talking about lactate, that is the measurement that is going to be taken when I'm getting the testing at the weekend. What I'm saying is that what will be tested is the level of blood lactate concentration in my body, and that's going to be important for me to gauge what my efforts are at certain paces, and that's going to be how I'm going to determine what my threshold paces are, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it is accepted that it's not actually the lactate that causes the fatigue in your body, but it's that there are hydrogen ions that are present in correlation with the amount of lactate in your blood that actually causes you to slow down. So these hydrogen ions create an overly acidic environment by reducing the pH level in your body, and that is basically what makes it hard for you to run and why you tire out. But when the hydrogen ions are high, the level of lactate is also high. So effectively what I'm saying is that although the hydrogen ions do the damage, the lactate is what is measured, and that is what is used to gauge the effort and to gauge the fatigue. So that's what's relevant, and that's what I'm going to be talking about, the levels of lactate in my body for the purposes of this video. So now that I've explained what lactate means, I want to talk about what lactate threshold means and how lactate threshold training can help you. So when I go on the treadmill and get tested, what's going to happen is that I'm going to start running and the paces will go up and up and up. And the person who's doing the testing is going to be getting readings of the blood lactate concentration in my body at particular paces. And at the end of that, I'm going to be showing a graph, and the y-axis, I think, will have the level of blood lactate concentration on it, and the x-axis will have a line down here that will be showing what the paces I was running at were. So the graph is going to show how much blood lactate concentration there was in my body and what this concentration was at different paces. So the higher the pace goes, the more the blood lactate concentration in my body will be. But it's important for my training purposes for me to understand where the particular thresholds are. And there are two main thresholds that I'm going to be getting tested. The first of these is LT1, which a lot of people refer to as the aerobic threshold, and it's known to be a pace that you can sustain for about 3 to 4 hours. So for most people, that's going to be in and around their marathon pace. When I'll be looking at the graph, and again, the graph will show the paces that I'm running against the blood lactate concentration. The LT1 is going to be where there's the first considerable increase in blood lactate concentration above resting levels. And although it's a considerable increase, it's not that much, because when my body is running at this pace, and I would guess that it's about 335 to 340 per K pace, my body is producing lactate, and it is producing a considerable amount of lactate at that pace, but it's also able to clear that lactate at a similar rate, and that's why I would be able to run that pace for a long period of time. So that's the first threshold pace, or lactate threshold pace, that I'm going to be getting. The second one is known as LT2, and you will hear people refer to that as the anaerobic threshold. And the anaerobic threshold is a pace that you could run at for approximately 1 hour if you were running a race. So it's a pretty fast pace. It's a pace that is known to be comfortably uncomfortable, as Jack Daniels would say, when you're training. But when I'm looking at that graph, and again, I've talked about what that graph is, but when I'm looking at that, it's going to show a rapid increase in the amount of blood lactate concentration in my body when the pace goes above a certain point. So that is called the lactate turning point. So the LT2 is very important for me to know, because I do quite a lot of my training at what I think my anaerobic threshold is. And the whole point of me getting the testing is that I want to know that I'm doing this training at just below that threshold pace, because if you start to go above these threshold paces, then you're running too hard and your body's producing too much lactate and you're getting tired too quickly, and you're not getting the benefits that training just under that threshold, or just at that threshold, really provides you with. So that's why that's going to be important. But as soon as you pass that LT2 stage, you will start to create a considerable amount of lactate, and your body is not able to clear that as quickly as it's being produced. And what that means is that you're going to tire out pretty soon after that, and you're not going to be able to sustain that pace for a long time, hence why you can only sustain it for about an hour. So now that I have spoken about what lactate threshold training is, and I've gone into a bit of detail about what LT1 being your aerobic threshold and LT2 being your anaerobic threshold is, I think it would be a good idea to give people a bit of information about how they can find out what these paces are. And the best way of doing that, if you're not going to do lactate testing, is to go on to a race equivalency calculator on Google and put in a recent racing time, whether it's a 5K or 10K, half marathon, marathon, it doesn't matter. But that will give you a list of different training paces. And one of those that they give is your threshold pace. And when they're talking about threshold pace, most of them are talking about your anaerobic threshold. So from that, you'll be able to find out your LT2. For example, if I put in my most recent 5K time onto a lot of those calculators, it'll say what my lactate threshold is. And when they're giving out that information, they're referring to my LT2 pace. So Your LT1 pace might be a bit harder to get, but you can usually have a guess as to what it is by just thinking about what your marathon pace would be or what you think you could sustain for a 3 or 4 hour period. So I do hope that helps. As a general guide, and this really is only a general guide, please do instead go on to a race equivalency calculator and get a more accurate indication. But for most people, I would say their anaerobic threshold, being their LT2, is probably about 15 to 25 seconds per K slower than their 5K race pace. So if you're running 5K in 15 minutes, your threshold pace is probably going to be somewhere like mine, between 3:15 and 3:25 roughly. But do check those race equivalency calculators, because that will differ for different people, and it's best to get a more accurate indication by going on to the race equivalency calculators. But it is important, as I've said, to understand that once you get those paces, that you make sure that they are an accurate version of where you're actually at, or that they are an accurate indication of where you're actually at. So if you ran a 20-minute 5K a few months ago, but that you're not in that type of condition now, there's no point putting that time into a race equivalency calculator. You need to be honest with yourself. And when you're thinking about your LT1 pace, think about a pace that you could realistically sustain for 3 to 4 hours if you're fit to run at that pace. And your LT2, think about a pace that you're able to sustain for 1 hour. So your LT2 pace, just to be clear, should be quicker than your LT1 pace. And that's just something to bear in mind. There are also other ways of gauging your threshold effort. Jack Daniels, when he's talking about your LT2 and your anaerobic threshold, will often say that it should feel comfortably uncomfortable. And what this means for a lot of people is that they could probably say a full sentence together while doing a threshold effort, but when they were doing something more than that, they'll probably only be able to say 1 or 2 words because they'll be out of breath and struggling to get any words out. So that's something that you can bear in mind. Also, if you use heart rate data to monitor your training, then for most people, your lactate threshold, being your LT2, your anaerobic threshold, which again I'm talking about most because it's something that I focus on most, that will be at about, when you're running at that LT2 pace, your heart rate will be at about 80 to 86% of your maximum heart rate. And for a well-trained athlete, that's going to be, according to Jack Daniels, somewhere more along the lines of 88 to 89 to 92% of your maximum heart rate. So for most people, it's their lactate threshold, their LT2 running pace is going to be at somewhere between 80 to 86% of their maximum heart rate. So if you go for an hour, or if you go for a 30-minute run and you're telling yourself it's a tempo run and your average heart rate is 185 beats per minute, and you know that your maximum heart rate is 200 beats per minute, then that means that you're not actually running at your threshold pace and that you've been running over that. And as I've said before, there are specific reasons as to why running at or below your LT1 and your LT2 are particularly beneficial. So it's important that you get those paces right and that you don't go above them, because that can be counterproductive. So if someone were to ask me, has threshold training improved my running over the last 15 months? I would say absolutely. I think threshold training was an important tool in my progress over the last 15 months, particularly when I first started out and I was used to playing football and doing things at a very high intensity, sprinting around a lot of the time, which caused me a lot of injuries, particularly hamstring injuries. And even when I was training on my own, I was often running at efforts that were causing me too much exertion and were causing me injury. And that's not what you want as an athlete. The worst thing you can have as an athlete is inactivity. So it's best to avoid injury. And threshold is good because it allows you to get quality work due to the fact that you're running at good paces, but because they're not VO2 max type sessions, when you do threshold sessions, they're just slightly below that. It means that you can recover quicker and you can do slightly more volume at this. Certainly at my level, this is something I have brought in gradually to my training, but it has meant that I can get good quality work and do slightly more of it because of the fact that it's not too intense and my body can recover better from it than it would a VO2 max session. I would say that threshold training was very important for me when I took my 10K time down from 37 minutes in November 22 to 31 minutes in April 2023. And a big part of that, I would say, was a 30-minute weekly tempo run that I did after January 2023 or so for about a 12-week period. And I found that that really helped me increase my strength. And over the course of about 12 weeks, my threshold pace, I think, went from about 342 to about 326, and that allowed me to run 31 minutes for the 10k, or was definitely instrumental in that. Okay, so how can you use threshold training to maximize your running performance and to get faster? Firstly, I should say that any type of threshold training that you're doing should be implemented gradually, particularly if you haven't done it before. So if you have just been running consistently but running easily over the last number of months, then you shouldn't go into doing threshold training twice a week straight away. You should maybe do it once a week and try to build it up gradually and build the volume up gradually. Secondly, I think that intervals are a great way to go. I regularly mix up my threshold training with intervals, and this can vary from 10 by a K to 5 by 2K to 6 by a mile to 4 by 8 minutes to 5 by 6 minutes. There's just a variety of different ways you can go about it, and of course, depending on what type of fitness you're looking to gain, you might be doing more at LT1 pace or you might be doing more at LT2 pace. Perhaps if you're training for a marathon, you'd be more focused on the LT1 pace because you're working more on your endurance and you're thinking more about that. Perhaps if you're looking at a 5k or a 10k, or you're a middle distance runner, you're perhaps slightly more focused on getting time at your LT2 pace, and that's absolutely fine. But I would say that those are some examples of intervals that you can use, but there are endless amounts of intervals that you can do. Also, it's become popular quite often in other sports to do slightly shorter threshold intervals. And what's important to understand is that when you're going probably below a K, a threshold, you're probably not actually running either the LT1 or LT2 paces, because the distance is so short that you're running at a slightly faster pace than what's actually classified as your LT2 pace. But comparatively, I suppose the idea is that it's a threshold type effort. So for example, if I'm doing 15 times 400 meters at supposedly threshold effort, this is actually going to be quicker than my anaerobic threshold, which is the distance I can run for an hour if I was racing. Because if I was only running my anaerobic threshold in a 400 meter rep, that wouldn't exert any kind of real energy from me because it would be so short. So I would probably be doing my threshold 400 meter intervals at around 5k pace, for example, but the recovery there would be slightly less than it would be in a longer interval. So maybe if I was doing 15 times 400, as I said, I might do those in about 72 to 75 seconds, which is going from my 5k, somewhere between my 5k pace and my 10k pace. But if and maybe taking 75 seconds, so about 1-to-1 ratio of work to recovery. But for those longer intervals of a K and more, so that when I'm doing 10 by a K, I would probably do those in about 320, and I'd probably take about a 60-second rest. So I suppose you could say that's a 3-to-1 work ratio. But anything above that, be it a mile or 2K or 3 by 2 mile, I would generally, and Jack Daniels would recommend, working on a 5-to-1 ratio of work to recovery. So that means if the interval takes you 10 minutes, then take a 2-minute recovery. If the interval takes you 5 minutes, then you take 60 seconds recovery. And again, the idea with threshold training is that because it's at speed that you could run at for 1 hour, it shouldn't be causing that much exertion that if you've been running at that for 10 minutes, you need a long break. The idea is that you're producing a decent amount of lactate, a considerable amount of lactate, particularly if you're running at LT2 pace, but also your body's able to clear this at a decent rate, and you want to give yourself a stimulus to get it even better at clearing it. So you don't want to give yourself too much of a recovery time because the intensity is controlled, and as Jack Daniels says, it's a pace that feels comfortably uncomfortable. What I want to finish with is just by saying that threshold training is a very important part of my training, but it's not the only part of my training, and I think it would be misleading to say that any type of training is more important than any other type of training. So threshold training consists of about 20 to 25% of my weekly volume, but it's not everything. I have easy running in there. I'll have some steady pace runs which are maybe slightly slower than your LT1 pace. Then I will have VO2 max workouts probably once a week, or no less often than once every 10 days. So I recommend, if you're at a level where your body can cope with that you incorporate those into your training too, because everything adds up and your fitness is effectively a sum of all the different types of training you're doing. And variety, I think, in training is very important. If you are not giving your body variety, then you're not giving it a stimulus to improve, because I always say that stress plus rest equals progress, but you only get that stress if you're shocking your body. And at times I think people can become a wee bit repetitive in the training, which you need to a certain extent, and over time your threshold will get better if you're doing continuous threshold work. But I think you also need to be including different aspects of your training. You need to be including harder intervals, but you also need to be making sure that you're doing your easy running and that you're allowing yourself to build a good base. What I'm really saying is that threshold training, which I hope I have now made clear to you what that is a very important part of your training and can go a long way to helping you to become a better runner. But don't neglect the other aspects of your training, which also help to move your fitness forward. I hope you all enjoyed that video. I hope that you're now looking forward to see my lactate testing video, because it's going to be very important for me to find out what my LT1 and particularly my LT2 paces are, because I've been guessing that my LT2 pace has been about 320, probably 315 to 325 per K for the last 6 months. I just don't really know if it has progressed that much since. I don't know if it's slower than that, if it's quicker than that, and I really could do with finding that out for the benefit of my training. So that's what the idea of this video was, and I think that you all now should have an idea of how you can go about adding threshold training into your own programs and how I can help you get faster. So thank you very much for tuning in. I will see you all again next week, and in the meantime, keep up your training and take care. Thank you.